When 24-year-old Carlos Rivera walked onto the Family Feud stage, the tattoos on his neck told one story. But when he answered people's opinion of who you used to be to a question about what's hardest to change, he began telling a different story, one that would remind everyone watching that redemption is possible, second chances matter, and sometimes the people who understand darkness best are the ones who can guide others toward light. Carlos moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to carry himself differently over the past 6 years. The gang tattoos were still visible on his neck and hands, permanent reminders of choices made when he was 16 and desperate. But his posture, his expression, the way he looked people in the eye with respect rather than challenge, spoke of a transformation that went deeper than any surface marking. He wore a simple button-down shirt and slacks, clothes that his current work required but that still felt foreign after years of baggy jeans and oversized hoodies designed to hide weapons and project intimidation. The transition from gang member to youth counselor had required learning not just new skills but a new way of existing in the world. The Rivera family had made the journey from East Los Angeles to Atlanta carrying hopes that had seemed impossible just a few years earlier. There was Maria Rivera, 52, Carlos's mother, who had prayed for her son every day during his 3 years in prison, never giving up hope that the boy she had raised was still somewhere inside the angry young man he had become. His father, Juan, 54, a mechanic who had worked double shifts to pay for lawyers and never missed a visiting day, believing that love could reach his son even through prison walls. His younger sister, Sophia, 19, now a pre-med student at UCLA, had written to Carlos every week during his incarceration, sharing her dreams and reminding him that their family story didn't have to end with his mistakes. And his older brother, Miguel, 28, a teacher who had refused to give up on Carlos even when everyone else thought he was beyond help. But perhaps most importantly, there was Mrs. Patterson, 67, Carlos's former high school English teacher, who had seen potential in him before the gangs did, and had never stopped believing in his ability to change. She had visited him in prison, helped him earn his GED, and was there when he was released, offering not just support but concrete opportunities to build a different life. Carlos had joined the Eastside Locos when he was 16, drawn by the promise of belonging, protection, and easy money that seemed like the only options available to a kid from his neighborhood. For 2 years he had lived the life, dealing drugs, carrying weapons, defending territory with violence that escalated until it felt like the only language he knew how to speak. The incident that changed everything had happened when he was 18. A rival gang member had been shot during a confrontation that Carlos had helped orchestrate. The victim had survived, but barely, and Carlos had been charged with assault with a deadly weapon and sentenced to 3 years in state prison. Prison had been a revelation, not the brutal experience he had expected, but an opportunity for education and reflection that he hadn't known he needed. He had earned his GED, taken college courses, participated in victim impact programs that forced him to confront the real consequences of his choices. Most importantly, he had met other men who had made similar journeys from violence to redemption, showing him that change was possible. Upon his release, Carlos had been determined to use his experience to help other young people avoid the path he had taken. He had completed his bachelor's degree in social work, specializing in gang intervention and youth counseling. For the past 2 years, he had worked at a community center in East LA, providing mentorship to teenagers who were facing the same choices he had confronted 8 years earlier. The decision to apply for Family Feud had been Sophia's idea, but it had taken months of convincing. Carlos was still sensitive about public attention, still aware that his appearance and background made people uncomfortable. The thought of being on national television, where his past would inevitably become part of the conversation, was daunting, but his family had convinced him that his story needed to be told, not as inspiration porn but as evidence that people can change, that second chances work when they're supported with genuine opportunity and community investment. Steve Harvey had been briefed about Carlos's background during rehearsal, but meeting him in person was different from reading a file. There was something about Carlos's presence, respectful but not deferential, confident but not cocky, aware of his past, but not defined by it, that immediately commanded respect. Carlos, Steve had said during the family introductions, tell us what you do for work. I'm a youth counselor, Carlos had replied clearly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned his credentials through both education and lived experience. I work with teenagers who are at risk of gang involvement, trying to help them see that they have more options than they might think. That's important work, Steve had said, and the audience had responded with appreciative applause. It is, Carlos had agreed. I know what it's like to think you don't have choices, to feel like violence is the only way to survive. I want these kids to know that there are other paths, even when those paths seem impossible. The game had progressed through 3 rounds with the Rivera family showing strong chemistry and competitive spirit. Carlos had contributed thoughtful answers, his responses revealing intelligence and wisdom that came from hard-won experience. When asked to name something that takes time to build, he had confidently answered, trust, earning the number 2 spot on the board, and nods of recognition from his family. But it was during the 4th round that everything changed. The question cut straight to the heart of human nature. Name the hardest thing to change. The competing family had just missed their opportunity to control the board, and it was the Rivera family's chance to steal. Juan had given the first answer, habits, which had earned a respectable spot. Maria had followed with your mind, another solid response that reflected her own journey of learning to believe in her son's transformation. Now it was Carlos's turn. He stepped forward to the podium, and for a moment he was quiet, not uncertain but gathering himself to speak about something that touched the core of his daily experience, the challenge that defined every interaction he had with new people. When he spoke, his voice carried across the studio with an honesty that cut through all pretense. People's opinion of who you used to be. The words hung in the air, with a weight that seemed to silence the entire studio. The audience fell quiet, sensing that this wasn't just a survey response but a deeply personal truth shared by someone who lived with this challenge every day. Steve's expression changed immediately. The entertainer's smile, the quick wit, the practiced responses, all of it fell away as he processed what Carlos had just said and understood the layers of meaning behind it. Carlos, Steve said softly, setting down his cards and approaching him, that's not just an answer, that's your life. Carlos nodded, maintaining eye contact with Steve in a way that spoke of someone who had learned to face difficult conversations with honesty and courage. Every day, Carlos replied simply, every job interview, every first meeting, every time someone sees my tattoos before they hear my story, I have to prove over and over again that I'm not who I used to be. Steve looked at this young man who was carrying the weight of his past while trying to build a future based on completely different values, who was using his mistakes as credentials to help others avoid making similar ones. Tell me about that, Steve said. What's it like to live with people judging you for who you were instead of seeing who you are now? Carlos took a moment to consider the question, clearly used to being asked to explain himself, but perhaps not used to being asked with genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. It's exhausting, he said honestly, but I understand it. I made choices that hurt people, that made communities less safe. I can't expect people to just forget that because I've changed. What I can do is show them through my actions, day after day, that people can grow beyond their worst decisions. Steve nodded, impressed by Carlos's maturity and self-awareness. And how do you do that? How do you show people who you are now? By showing up, Carlos replied, without hesitation. By being consistent. By doing the work even when people don't believe in me yet. The kids I work with, they don't care about my college degree or my certifications. They care that I understand what they're going through, because I've been there. They trust me because I don't judge them for making mistakes. I help them learn from those mistakes before they become permanent consequences. The studio was completely silent now, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of people unsure how to react. It was the profound quiet of individuals recognizing wisdom, authenticity, and the kind of hard-won insight that can only come from genuine transformation. Steve Harvey had interviewed countless people, had heard every possible variation of human experience. But something about Carlos's combination of humility, honesty, and determination to use his past as a tool for helping others moved him in unexpected ways. Carlos, Steve said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Do you ever regret the choices you made, or do you see them as necessary parts of your journey to who you are now? Carlos considered the question carefully, understanding that his answer would reveal something important about his character and his relationship with his own history. I regret the pain I caused, he said finally. I regret the fear I brought to my community. The nights my mother couldn't sleep wondering if I was safe or if I was making someone else's family unsafe. I regret that I chose violence when I could have chosen something else. He paused, his expression becoming more thoughtful. But I don't regret the journey that brought me to where I am now. Because without that experience, without understanding what it feels like to be lost and angry and convinced that you don't have options, I wouldn't be able to reach the kids I work with now. My past is the reason they listen to me. Steve looked at this remarkable young man who had found a way to transform his worst experiences into his greatest strengths, who had refused to let his mistakes define his future, while still taking full responsibility for them. Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. Carlos, Steve said, I want everyone in this studio to understand something. You just gave us a masterclass in redemption, in taking responsibility, and in using your life experiences to make the world better. He addressed the entire studio. This young man could have come out of prison angry, bitter, convinced that society would never give him a fair chance. Instead, he chose to earn a second chance by dedicating his life to preventing other young people from making the mistakes he made. The audience began to react, not with pity or condescension, but with genuine respect for someone who had done the hard work of changing his life and was now helping others do the same. But Steve wasn't finished. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something that caught the studio lights, his key ring, containing not just his car keys, but several other keys that represented different aspects of his life and career. Carlos, Steve said, approaching him with the gravity of someone bestowing an honor, these are the keys to my success. Car keys, office keys, studio keys, all the physical symbols of the opportunities I've been given in my life. He placed the key ring gently in Carlos's hands. But you know what? You already have the most important keys. You have the keys to redemption, to second chances, to helping other people unlock doors they didn't even know existed. Carlos accepted the keys with obvious emotion, understanding the symbolic weight of the gesture. But I want to give you something else, Steve continued. He removed his watch, an expensive timepiece that he wore to every important event, every significant moment in his career. Time, Steve said, placing the watch on Carlos's wrist. That's what you're giving those kids, time to think, time to choose differently, time to understand that their first decisions don't have to be their final decisions. Carlos looked down at the watch, overwhelmed by the generosity and the recognition that it represented. Steve, he said, his voice thick with emotion, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Steve replied. You've already said everything that matters. You've shown everyone here that people can change, that second chances work when they're supported with genuine opportunity. He turned to address the entire studio. Ladies and gentlemen, Carlos Rivera represents something beautiful about America. The belief that your worst day doesn't have to define your best day, that mistakes can become wisdom, that people who understand darkness can guide others toward light. The audience erupted in sustained applause, but this time it was different from typical game show cheering. It was recognition of genuine transformation, acknowledgement of the hard work required to change one's life, appreciation for someone who had chosen to use his experience to benefit others. As the cameras stopped rolling and the audience began to file out, something remarkable happened. Person after person approached Carlos, not to express amazement at his transformation, but to thank him for his honesty, to share their own stories of second chances, to ask about the work he was doing with young people. One elderly woman approached with tears in her eyes. My grandson is making some of the same choices you made, she told Carlos. Can you give me some advice about how to reach him? Carlos spent 20 minutes talking with her, sharing resources, offering specific suggestions, demonstrating the same patience and wisdom he brought to his professional work. 6 months later, the episode aired exactly as it happened, with no editing to minimize the emotional weight of Carlos's story or Steve's unprecedented gesture. The response was immediate and profound. Youth organizations across the country reached out to Carlos, wanting to learn about his approach to gang intervention. The clip became a training tool for criminal justice reform programs, showing how rehabilitation and reintegration could work when supported with genuine opportunity and community investment. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from other former gang members and formerly incarcerated individuals who saw in Carlos's story proof that redemption was possible, that second chances could lead to meaningful lives dedicated to helping others. Carlos returned to his work at the community center with renewed confidence and expanded resources. Steve's gesture had given him not just material support, but symbolic validation that his work mattered, that his transformation was recognized and respected. He kept Steve's keys and watch as daily reminders that time and opportunity are gifts to be used wisely, that second chances come with responsibilities, that redemption is measured not by personal success, but by service to others. The community center where Carlos worked saw immediate increases in funding and volunteer support after the episode aired. Parents who had been hesitant to trust their children to a program run by a former gang member began to understand that sometimes the best guides are those who have walked the dangerous path themselves. Steve Harvey said in later interviews that meeting Carlos changed his understanding of judgment, redemption, and the power of second chances. "He taught me that the question isn't whether people can change," Steve said. "The question is whether we're brave enough to believe in that change and support it when it happens." Carlos went on to earn his master's degree in social work, specializing in gang intervention and criminal justice reform. He became a sought-after speaker at conferences on youth development and reintegration, sharing his story not as inspiration, but as evidence that comprehensive support systems and genuine opportunities can transform lives. The lesson that day wasn't about feeling sorry for someone who had made bad choices or being impressed by dramatic transformation. It was about understanding that redemption requires not just individual change, but community support, that second chances work when they're backed by genuine opportunities, and that some of the most effective helpers are those who understand the problems they're solving from the inside. Steve Harvey learned that sometimes the most powerful moments in television happen when you recognize someone's growth, rather than judging their past, when you choose to see potential rather than limitations, when you understand that everyone's story includes chapters they wish they could rewrite. And Carlos Rivera proved that the hardest thing to change, people's opinions of who you used to be, can be changed through consistent action, genuine service, and the kind of patient persistence that transforms not just individual lives, but entire communities' understanding of what redemption looks like when it's real.